The moon hung heavy in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the small town of Briar Glen. It was a crisp autumn night, and the wind rustled through the trees, whispering secrets only the leaves could understand. On the outskirts of town, tucked away behind a long gravel driveway, stood an old Victorian mansion. For years, the mansion had sat vacant, its once grand halls and rooms left to gather dust. But tonight, it was alive again, illuminated by the soft glow of candlelight and the sounds of laughter. Evelyn, the hostess, stood in the grand dining room, her eyes scanning the long, polished table adorned with fine china, crystal glasses, and silverware. She had prepared everything meticulously. The centerpiece was a bouquet of blood-red roses, surrounded by scattered petals and dark candles that flickered as though they were breathing. The smell of roasted lamb and rich wine filled the air, promising a night of decadence and indulgence. Her guests were arriving, one by one, each of them dressed in formal attire as requested by the invitation she had sent out a month prior. There was Jonathan, a tall man in his mid-40s with slicked back hair and a sharp, almost predatory smile. His wife, Margaret, a petite woman with a reserved demeanor, who rarely spoke but always seemed to observe everything around her. Then there was Peter, a heavyset man with a hearty laugh, always the life of the party, and Alice, an artist with dark, expressive eyes and a certain melancholy air about her. As the last of her guests arrived, Evelyn stood at the head of the table, her lips curling into a satisfied smile. The evening was just beginning, and she had ensured that this would be a night no one would forget. "Welcome, everyone," she said, raising her glass of red wine. The guests all followed suit, their glasses catching the candlelight. "To old friends and new memories. May this dinner bring us closer together." The group echoed her toast, clinking their glasses before sipping the rich, dark wine. Evelyn set her glass down and motioned for them to take their seats. As they began to serve themselves from the platters of food that Evelyn had prepared, tender lamb, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, there was an undercurrent of unease that none of the guests could quite place. It wasn't just the atmosphere, though the old mansion did seem to hold a strange, oppressive energy. No, it was something more, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. The conversation started easily enough, small talk about recent events in town, the weather, and other pleasantries. But as the night wore on, and the wine continued to flow, the tone began to shift. "Evelyn," Peter said between bites, "I've got to hand it to you. This dinner is magnificent, but I have to ask, why did you invite us here tonight? It's been years since we've all seen each other." The room fell quiet, everyone waiting for Evelyn's response. She smiled, a glint of something unreadable in her eyes. "I thought it was time we all reconnected," she said smoothly. "It's been too long since we've gathered like this, and I have a special reason for tonight." Her guests exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of her cryptic words. Jonathan leaned forward, his sharp smile fading slightly. "A special reason?" Evelyn took a long sip of her wine before answering. "Yes, you see, tonight's dinner is different from any other you've attended." Before anyone could ask her to clarify, the chandelier above them flickered, the light dimming for a brief moment. Alice glanced up at the ceiling, her brow furrowing. "Did you see that? Probably just old wiring," Peter said with a shrug, though his tone was less confident than usual. But Margaret wasn't so easily reassured. She had been watching Evelyn carefully all night, and there was something about the way she was sitting now, so poised and in control, that set her on edge. "What do you mean by different?" Margaret asked, her voice low and wary. Evelyn's smile widened, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, you see, there's someone missing." At that moment, the room grew unnaturally cold, and the flickering candles seemed to dim even further. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing around the room as if expecting someone else to appear. "What do you mean, missing?" "We're all here." Evelyn set her wine glass down gently and stood up, moving slowly to the door of the dining room. "No," she said softly, "not all of us." As she opened the door, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside the room, slow, deliberate, and heavy. The air became thick with tension as the guests turned to face the door, their hearts pounding in their chests. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the door. The silence that followed was suffocating. Evelyn stepped back, her eyes fixed on the doorway, as though she were waiting for something or someone. The room was so still, the only sound was the ragged breathing of her guests. Without warning, the door creaked open on its own. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and shadowy, its face obscured by darkness. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, an ominous presence that filled the room, with a sense of dread so intense it was almost palpable. Alice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the figure. Who is that? Evelyn didn't answer. She only smiled, her expression one of cold satisfaction. Peter, his usual bravado gone, stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. What the hell is this, Evelyn? Is this some kind of joke? But Evelyn shook her head. No joke, Peter. You see, there's always been one more guest, the one none of you could see. Until now. The figure in the doorway began to move forward, its steps slow and deliberate. As it entered the room, the temperature seemed to drop even further, the air becoming almost unbreathable. The guests were frozen in place, their eyes wide with fear. Jonathan, his face pale, tried to speak but couldn't find the words. Margaret gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, as the figure moved closer, its shadow falling over the room. Evelyn stepped forward, standing beside the figure, her eyes gleaming in the candlelight. This house, she said softly, has always had a way of keeping its guests ... even the ones who never leave. As the figure reached the table, it stopped, its shadow stretching across the floor like a black stain. The guests stared in horror as the candles flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows across the room. The figure raised its hand, and a deep, guttural sound filled the air, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the echo of its presence. The guests were left in stunned silence, the terror still hanging heavy in the air. Evelyn, her expression calm, returned to her seat at the head of the table. She picked up her wine glass and raised it once more. To our final guest, she said softly, her voice carrying a strange, hollow tone. The guests, shaken and terrified, slowly raised their glasses in response. Though none of them dared to speak, the room was silent once more, save for the faint sound of the wind outside, rustling the trees as if whispering its approval. The dinner continued, though the mood had shifted entirely. The guests ate in silence, their eyes flicking nervously toward the door, as though expecting the shadowy figure to return at any moment. And as the night wore on, they realized that something had changed, something deep and uncheckable. They were no longer just Evelyn's guests, they were prisoners of the house, just like the final guest who had come before them.